Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the seminar on peace and organized crime. This seminar is an initiative of the Chair on Countering Illicit Trade and Preventing Transnational Organized Crime at the University for Peace. And today's seminar is in partnership with the Institute for Economics and Peace with the support of Ideas for Peace. This is the second seminar we organize with IEP, being the first one on the Mexico Peace Index. For today's presentation, we have Michael Collins, the Executive Director at the Institute for Economics and Peace, who will discuss positive peace, a quantitative peace building framework. Michael develops working partnerships with Americas-based governments, civil society organizations, foundations, university, business, and think tanks, and seeks new opportunities to build IP's presence and impact throughout the Americas, with particular focus on expanding the use of IP's positive peace framework as a training tool and an evidence-based metric for peace-centered development. Before joining IP, Michael oversaw educational, job creation, and economic development programs in emerging nations recovering from natural disasters, working frequently with communities affected by poverty and gang violence. Michael, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to have you here with this session with the students enrolled on the course Peace Building, Organized Crime, and State Fragility. The floor is yours.
That's wonderful, Mauricio. Thank you very much, and welcome everybody. We really appreciate the opportunity. Mauricio, you quickly mentioned the Mexico Peace Index. Could I just get a quick raise of hands or a thumbs up for anybody or everybody who attended that particular session? Great. Well, that's actually great news because that means I can kind of sort of start from scratch. So my understanding currently is that things that you've sort of touched on as part of the course include the notion on state fragility, corruption as a threat to peace building, organized crime and its impact on peace building, and then peace building as a framework for international policy. So one of the things that I'd love to do is to kind of sort of continue to delve into this, but also in a sort of a standalone way for those of us who may be sort of joining us independently as well. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. And you should be able to see that without an issue. Let me just go ahead and put the node in here. There we are. Slideshow. Excellent. And I was just mentioning to Mauricio as well that we'll actually split this up into two sections. One is kind of sort of more quantitative, data driven, and the other one is sort of softer or somewhat conceptual in nature. But I really look forward to your questions today, and I'm ready to dive in. Very quickly, just about the Institute. We're a nonprofit, nonpartisan research institution dedicated to shifting the world's focus to peace as a positive, tangible, and achievable measure of human well-being and progress. We do that primarily by developing sort of quantitative reports around peace, namely the Global Peace Index, the Positive Peace Report, also thematic reports such as the Global Terrorism Index, for example, national reports like the Mexico Peace Index, and other forms of reports related to business and peace, religions and peace, and we recently produced a report on the impact of COVID on peace as well. We have a number of offices around the world, and thankfully, our reports are very well received. They're used extensively by multilateral organizations. It's included in a lot of university courses. Our web pages are visited frequently, and we have a strong social media presence. More than kind of sort of a promotional slide, this is really to kind of sort of reinforce the appetite that seems to not only exist, but seems to be growing around the study of peace and kind of sort of the quantitative study of peace and peace building more broadly. You know, IEP in its kind of simplest form, I suppose you could say, we try and answer essentially two questions. Question number one is, what are the most peaceful countries on earth? And question number two is, well, what do those peaceful countries have in common? And the idea here is that the more we know about the characteristics of peaceful societies, the more we can kind of sort of help replicate those conditions in the societies in which we all live, or in sort of the societies in which we are sort of seeking to help or to support. Now, those two questions kind of sort of neatly tie into a couple of terms that are used very frequently in the peace building field. And those are the terms of negative peace and positive peace. A lot of you are no doubt very familiar with these terms already. They're commonly used. Now, negative peace we define ourselves as the absence of violence or fear of violence. Now, the term is a bit of a misnomer in the sense that it's not necessarily negative. In fact, it's a good thing, but it's a superficial definition of peace. Positive peace is something much richer. It's essentially the underlying attitudes, institutions, and structures that create and sustain peaceful societies over time. A country may have high levels of negative peace, for example. In other words, it may have little violence and little fear of violence, but it may be very, very vulnerable to future conflict, or it may be vulnerable to all forms of future crisis, and it may not have opportunities to prosper. I think you would agree that that is kind of a very superficial definition of peace. So we try and measure those two things quantitatively. We're going to spend most of our time on positive peace, but to contextualize that a bit, I'm going to jump in as to how we go about measuring negative peace. And I'd love to start with a question and perhaps have a bit of fun with you guys. For those of you who haven't actually had an opportunity to look at the Global Peace Index, what are some of the most peaceful countries on earth, do you think? Why don't you go ahead? Let's spend 30 seconds sticking any of the immediate ones that come to mind in the chat box. How does that sound? Costa Rica, Sweden, Iceland. I'm glad the first one that came up was Costa Rica, Sweden, Denmark, New Zealand, Austria. Excellent. Finland. Yes, a lot of Nordic countries, Scandinavian countries as well. New Zealand, Costa Rica. Well, the truth is that all of those countries mark relatively high on the Global Peace Index. Costa Rica is also high on there as well. I'll show you the detail of how we of the top 10 countries, and you can compare that in the next couple of minutes. How we measure it is we produce this annual report, Global Peace Index. We've been doing it for nearly 15 years now. It measures 163 countries around the world. That's about 99.7% of the world's population, according to their relative measure of peace. Now, we use a whole variety of different indicators using methodology that we've developed, but is guided and overseen by an international panel of experts. These 23 indicators that we use are split into sort of 3 different domains. The first one is mostly related to ongoing conflict, and that is essentially wars and open conflicts, including the intensity of those conflicts and the number of deaths. But also things, for example, like tensions with neighboring countries. The second domain is more of an internal domain. It's actually the one that we weight the most in the Global Peace Index. And that's related to things, for example, like homicide rates, incarceration rates, the number of refugees, the impact of terrorism, etc. And then the third one is a level of militarization that a country has. That includes things like military expenditure, weapons imports and exports, the availability of small arms and nuclear weapons capability, for example. So you may see countries that do particularly well in one particular domain that are perhaps very sort of safe countries to be in, but are nonetheless very militaristic in nature and therefore score very lowly on the Global Peace Index. This is an interactive map and is kind of sort of a mud map of the results of the Global Peace Index in any given year. You can actually visit the IEP webpage or the Vision of Humanity webpage, and you can interact with this map by clicking on any individual country and looking at those indicators and being able to track them over time as well. So for those of you waiting for the answers, this is how IEP at least determined to be the most peaceful countries in 2019 using those measures. Costa Rica is not quite in there. I think it currently ranks at 32nd, but as you can see, a lot of the countries that you mentioned are. Now it tracks countries throughout the gamut, all 163. So for example, it also tracks the 10 least peaceful countries, and kind of as a general rule of thumb, things that we see time and time again is that the countries that tend to be on the higher part of the Global Peace Index are generally liberal democracies, more democratic in nature, whereas the countries on the lower part of the Global Peace Index tend to be more authoritarian. These 10 least peaceful countries that you see here, pretty much all of these are in a state of open war with the exception of Russia. Now, the Global Peace Index as a report also does things like kind of sort of tracks regional trends, for example, as you can see here. It looks into individual countries and sort of top improvers or top deteriorations over time. But critically, it also tracks peacefulness over time, in fact, over a period of 10 years. One of the things that we see in last year's report is that essentially peacefulness has declined significantly and continuously over the last 10 years. In fact, for 9 out of the last 12 years. Overall, it's deteriorated about 2.5%. We also sort of break it down per domains. We see that while the militarization domain has improved globally across the world, the actual number of conflicts has increased significantly. Now, when I first saw this slide, I thought, hey, well, hold on a minute. Does that mean that we should be investing more in the military? That doesn't really stand up when we look at that sort of in a granular fashion. We see countries that invest significantly in the military. Some countries invest significantly in the military, can have significant amount of conflict or very little, and the opposite is also true. Other things that the report does that you can, of course, access is, for example, trends in global civil unrest. As you can see, there's been a significant increase in levels of civil unrest around the world. You no doubt see this on the news, but as we can see, it's been increasing over the last 5 to 6 years. And broadly, even more broadly speaking, what we see is over the same period, this sort of significant increase in what we call the peace gap. We see that for the most part, countries that have got high levels of peace on the Global Peace Index have continued to improve in peacefulness, whereas we've seen a significant deterioration in peacefulness for the countries that already had low levels of peace. Now, all of this stuff is pretty kind of sort of depressing, I should say. And it also really doesn't give us a sort of a whole lot of insight as to sort of potential solutions, right? In fact, it kind of almost creates an obstacle. It makes us feel like the problem is impenetrable and that there's really nothing that we can do about it. And this is really where positive peace comes in, right? Is being able to understand, well, what is it that creates peaceful societies and how can we try and replicate that in the countries that are currently suffering from low levels of peace? So the way that IEP does this is we take the global results ranks from the Global Peace Index on one side, and then we cross-reference those indicators with thousands upon thousands of socioeconomic data sets to be able to see what are sort of the socioeconomic, cultural, political factors that most closely correlate with subsequent deteriorations or improvements in levels of peacefulness according to the Global Peace Index. So I'm going to shoot the question out there to everybody again. Based on your gut feeling here, what do you think are some of the characteristics of the most peaceful nations on Earth? Let's take another 30 seconds. Education, thank you very much, Daniela. Healthcare, employment rate, adequate healthcare. Adherence to human rights principles, wonderful. Standard of living, that's great. Strong institutions, yeah. GPA, I'm not sure what that acronym is. Strong judicial systems, affordable housing. Well, I'm very happy to say that according to essentially, our measures, pretty much everything that you have said is true. What we see when we do this work is that we see that broadly speaking, there are actually over 300 indicators that we were able to sort of identify as being lead indicators of subsequent deteriorations or improvements in peacefulness. But doing a sort of a form of statistical clumping, we're able to put these in essentially 8 buckets. And these are the characteristics of the most peaceful societies on Earth. The most peaceful societies have a well-functioning government that has rule of law, that ensures the peaceful transition of power and provides good quality public services. There's an equitable distribution of resources with regards to healthcare, with regards to education. There's a free flow of information, both in terms of people's access to information, but also the quality of the information that they receive. There's good relations with neighbors. When we're talking at the nation state level, we're talking about trade agreements between neighboring countries, for example, or immigration deals. High levels of human capital with regards to a trained, knowledgeable, productive, and employed workforce. There's the acceptance of the rights of others with regards to gender, with regards to sexuality, race, religion, etc. There's low levels of corruption, and there is a sound business environment. So both small and large and informal and formal businesses can grow and they can innovate as well. Now, the countries with high levels of positive peace also benefit from a whole other array of things. For example, high levels of positive peace are associated with higher per capita income, which is something that somebody mentioned specifically. They have high levels of resilience to all forms of crisis, such as COVID-19, but also natural disasters, for example. They have better environmental outcomes, they have higher measures of well-being, and they even perform better on the sustainable development goals as well. So I'm just going to shoot out a couple of examples here in sort of graph format. These are countries with higher and lower levels of positive peace. As you can see, countries with lower levels of positive peace are significantly more vulnerable to political shocks, more vulnerable to violent conflict, and even more vulnerable to things like genocide, for example. If we were to look at things like the nature of civil resistance campaigns, we see that countries with high levels of positive peace, these 8 characteristics essentially, these civil resistance campaigns, there are a lot less of them, they're a lot less violent, they last less, but most importantly of all, they're a lot more likely to attain their aims because of the democratic nature and the systems in place to be able to cater for differences in perspectives and opinion. Another example is, for example, if we look at the frequency of natural disasters versus the fatalities, we see that fatalities in countries with low levels of positive peace are 13 times higher than countries with high levels of positive peace, independently of the frequency. So by one of the sort of the pragmatic ways that we use to be able to track what we call these levels of sort of positive peace around the world is by developing a similar index to the Global Peace Index, but in this case, tracking these positive peace characteristics. We take the 3 strongest correlated indicators from each of these pillars, and we use that to develop a ranking as well, based on countries' levels of positive peace. And why is this important? Well, because number one, it kind of sort of allows us to be able to gain a better understanding of what are these characteristics and how things are changing over time. For example, if we look into levels of positive peace globally over the last 10 or 12 years, we see that things like institutions have continued to strengthen over time, despite the fact that we talk about a crisis of multilateralism, for example. We see that government institutions have strengthened. We've seen that a lot of the structures related to positive peace, things like levels of poverty, the distribution of resources, GDP, for example, have continued to improve globally as well, but we see a significant deterioration in the attitudes domain. So that includes, for example, things here, and these are the indicators that we track on the left-hand side. Significant deteriorations in things like the quality of information that people are having access to globally, resulting or parallel to an increase in hostility towards foreigners, a deterioration in factionalized elites. Factionalized elites refers to the reality or the impression that the government is being run by people who are not representative of the citizenry. Crackdowns on freedom of the press, deteriorations in rule of law, exclusion by socioeconomic group, leading to deterioration in the equal distribution of resources as well. Now, one of the important things about the Positive Peace Index is that it also has this breakdown per country. So any individual country or any government can kind of sort of look at this and try and find ways to be able to improve their positive peace levels over time. And why is that important? Well, because once again, positive peace acts as a lead indicator of a country's subsequent level of peacefulness or of negative peace over time. So just to kind of sort of reinforce this, when we sort of look at the data, what we see, for example, is that nearly 70% of countries that had a positive peace deficit. Now, what do I mean by that? A positive peace deficit is if, for example, there is a country that has got relatively high levels of peace on the Global Peace Index, but let's say scores very low on the Positive Peace Index, right? Let's say that, and in this case, more than 20 places. We would call that a positive peace deficit. And by contrary, you could have a scenario, for example, in which the country has higher levels of positive peace, but has much lower levels on the Global Peace Index. Now, essentially what this means is that if there is a country that is has high levels of has high levels of peacefulness on the Global Peace Index, but low levels of positive peace, that means that that country is likely to deteriorate in peacefulness over time. As you can see, nearly 70% of countries with a positive peace deficit recorded deteriorations in negative peace from 2009 to 2019. Now, as that deficit increases, that deterioration increases also, and the likelihood of deterioration increases also. So by the time you get to sort of 50 places, 90% of countries with a positive peace deficit, more than 50 places, deteriorated over the same time. And that is essentially because that level of socioeconomic resilience that they have, which we measure through sort of the positive peace and the positive peace index, is not enough to be able to sustain the country's existing level of negative peace. And you could have a country with high levels of peacefulness or low levels of peacefulness on their negative peace index, but is nonetheless well equipped to be able to deal with that and therefore bounce back to higher levels of peacefulness over time. So that kind of sort of concludes, I think, sort of the main data-driven component, both in terms of measuring negative and positive peace. I mentioned before that there's sort of a softer side, a more conceptual side to this. I find it pretty interesting. I'd love to be able to share it with you, but I think it's probably important here to sort of stop for questions.
Thank you very much. The floor is open. AB, please.
Thank you so much for joining us today, Michael. I'm wondering if you can speak to if there's been a deterioration since 2016 when Trump was elected in the United States to when he was out of office at the beginning of this year, just the changes in positive peace as well as negative peace.
Yes. So the short answer is yes, but the longer answer is that that deterioration has actually been happening there has been an acceleration in the last 5 or 6 years, but that deterioration has been happening over the last 10 or 12. So it does span completely different administrations. And the other thing I would say is that it's also symptomatic of a lot of the things that we are seeing globally. If you were to look at, for example, the positive peace indicators in the United States, you could, and the deteriorations and improvements, you could pretty much map them on par with things that are happening in Europe and things that are happening in many countries around the world. So while there has been a deterioration in some levels, and I think some of these are responsible, are due to some of the changes made in the previous administration, I think that there are much broader factors at play.
Thank you, AB. Dani, please.
Thank you. Thank you for being here. I was wondering more about both indexes. I wanted to know, what do you think is data that is missing, that is not there? And what is some data that was just difficult to get or impossible to get across all these examples? Because when you talk about something so big, I imagine there's a lot of data that you wish you could have access to, but it's not been able to yet.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Danny. And that is definitely a challenge of sort of trying to create these global indices. So number one, for example, the larger the set of countries that you're trying to include, the more data challenges that you have. Let's say, for example, that you just have 2 countries and you want to develop a 2-country index. But in one country, they collect 10 pieces of data or 10 data points, and in the other country, they collect 3. But in order to develop the sort of the 2-country index, you can only use 3 data points from each country, right? Which means that you miss out on a lot of the granularity that you could potentially have access to if you were doing something more specific to a country. If you take the Mexico Peace Index, for example, we do a breakdown of each of the individual states, and we use a whole other amount of information that's accessible at that level. So we are limited by that. By the global comparability of that data. You know, some of the challenges include that there are very different definitions of things like homicide around the world, or things like rape, for example. Even there's distinct definitions in rape between places that you wouldn't think, such as the United States and Canada. A lot of that information isn't actually comparable between those 2 countries. So that is definitely a challenge. And then just more broadly, just general data gaps. And whenever that happens to us, what we try and do is we try and complement that in the best way we can through quantitative research, or by analyzing trends over time and kind of sort of plugging in the gaps, or by proxy. So the full methodology for both the Global Peace Index and Positive Peace Index is included in the back of the report, and we partner with the Economist Intelligence Unit for the quantitative elements.
Thank you, Danny. Amy, please.
Thank you. I have two questions. One, first is how, except creating report, are you doing for the worst country? Do you like name and shame, or do you do any punishment? And the other is how this data collected. Do you have stuff in each country in the world?
Yeah, thank you, Amy. No, the short answer is we don't name and shame. Now, IP is very careful in fact, our reputation depends on it, to be neutral in all cases, and in no way is the research that we do based on any moral opinion or ethical belief, and we pass no judgment on what is the ideal amount of peace. I mean, we acknowledge, for example, that there is always going to be criminality. There will always be the need for police. There will always be the need of a military, right? And it's not really for IEP to say what is the optimal amount of that, because that will actually change depending on the culture, depending on the norms. Let's say, for example, that you take the police rate in two different countries. Let's say you say Finland, and let's say that you say Mexico. In one country, people are going to be happy because there's a lot of police on the streets. And in another country, they're going to be terrified because there's a lot of police on the streets. So the answer to all of these things is very contextual. And what we try and do is we try and provide as much information as we possibly can so that each individual country can make the appropriate decisions based on what they feel their needs are. All of the research that we collect is largely public sources. So it includes things like the World Bank, it includes research institutions, it includes the Uppsala data, it includes UN data as well. Once again, it's all back in the methodology. And the partner we have for the qualitative component does have staff allocated in essentially every single countries of the ones that we track.
Thank you, Amy. Christoph, please.
Hello, I have a question about Russia, because when I saw it the first time, when Mauricio showed it to us, I was very amazed, but also a little bit shocked to see Russia, and along with countries like Somalia and other war-driven countries. So could you maybe expand a little bit more about this?
Yeah, absolutely, Christoph, and I'd be happy to. And I'd also like to draw a parallel with the United States, for example, which is also sort of a superpower. One of the challenges of Russia, and one of the reasons that it scores so lowly on the index, is related in part to, for example, its significant involvement in foreign wars, as well as kind of sort of its intimidation of other countries, and also internal dynamics related to safety and security as well. Now, if I extend that to the US, and just to kind of sort of make the example even more clear, if you have a look at the Global Peace Index, you actually see that the US scores, and I need to refresh my memory exactly which countries now, but scores only slightly higher or equal to countries like, say, Honduras, right, that have significant issues with regards to safety in the country. And that is because we follow this sort of this multi-dimensional analysis, and we track it according to many different indicators in different domains. Now, the United States, for example, has got one of the highest levels of incarceration in the world. It's got extremely high homicide rates, but it's also involved in multiple foreign wars. It invests significantly in the military. It has nuclear weapons capability. It's got a high availability of small arms. So even if inside the country, for example, for the most part, it is relatively peaceful, there are a number of different indicators that drag it down. And that's the same for Russia too.
Thank you, Christoph. Iheni?
Okay, thank you very much. I have two questions to ask. One, have you in the course of carrying your work up, doing publications that countries have questions on the credibility of your report. Like, for example, I know that in Nigeria, most times, if Amnesty International publish their results on the way security personnel handle issues of human rights, the Nigerian government always question it and ask for credibility of the report.
Mhm.
Secondly, when you do the research, do you also consider the role of multinationals in influencing policies that most times cause chaos and issues in a particular area? Still on the Nigeria issues, multinational companies play a role in Niger Delta, creating a conflict here and there. So do you also consider that to actually bring your report to bear?
Yes, I'm sorry. When you refer to multinationals, do you mean to multinational corporations, for example, or do you refer to multinational efforts such as the UN or organizations such as the UN?
Multinational, such as, for example, Chevron,
Yep.
Shell.
Yeah, absolutely.
Multinational companies.
So the yeah, with regards to criticism, I mean that is something that essentially comes with the work, and you know there are kind of sort of no specific instances that I could sort of mention broadly, but I mean, you know, one is always limited by the information that that one has available. One of the things that we always try and do is try and be completely transparent. So recognizing all of the limitations that the data has, and also sticking very closely to a definition. For example, just to go back to Christoph's point, you know, we've had significant kickback here in the United States, for example, when we talk about the United States being 132nd on the, sorry, 128th, I think it is, on the Global Peace Index, right? People here in the United States would say, well, how can that possibly be? So we kind of sort of go through the explanation. We kind of sort of, it's not that we justify it, it's that essentially we stick to a very tight definition. We stick to very close indicators. We share those indicators and the sources freely. We talk about the weighting that we give, and essentially we sort of describe the whole methodology that we follow. In a nutshell, we only know what we know, and we don't know what we don't, and we are happy with that. One of the things that we're very careful about is to not sort of infer causality in the cases where there might not be, or there might be. So that touches on the second part of your question. We tend to stay away from kind of sort of making that form of analysis because it would be more qualitative in nature, and we just currently don't have access to sort of the data points that would allow us to be able to study that phenomenon kind of sort of more in detail, I suppose you could say. That doesn't mean that don't get me wrong, that doesn't mean that it shouldn't be done. I think it's just a work in progress.
Thank you, Henny. Miss Ellie, please.
I think you have answered a bit of my question already, but I'm just wondering about official data, like, you know, government-based that sometimes and many times is biased. And then how do you deal with that? You just go with it, or how do you take the decision or on what to include and what to exclude?
So the decisions on what to include are taken by an expert panel, which reviews the indicators that we use on an annual basis. All of those indicators are, at least according to our consideration, of repute, and we are always very careful about you know, sort of cross-referencing those and checking those with other sources as well. You know, once again, we are limited by essentially what information is available, and I do acknowledge that when it comes to national statistics offices and especially ways of collecting data, there are significant deficiencies around the world. And it's just a case of doing the best that we can with the information that we have.
Thank you, Ms. Ellie. Megan, please.
Hello, thank you so much, Michael, for being here. This is a fascinating presentation. It's very much in line with what we've been talking about throughout the course. So I have two questions. During the course, we had a discussion about the importance of kind of bottom-up approaches to peace building and making sure that there's local legitimacy. I've done some research work on measuring access to justice. So I know specifically related to access to justice, it's essential to make sure that you're capturing perception. So using like survey-based measures and different methodologies to make sure you're actually really focusing on the voices of the people. I'm
Yes.
wondering if it's the same in measuring peace. Do you have any reflections on that?
So it does actually, your question does in some ways kind of sort of lead me into what would be the second part of this presentation, this kind of sort of softer, more conceptual component, but that specifically relates to how access to justice is interpreted by the communities that you are trying to support or the community that you form part of. So I think that we will be able to touch on that. You know, one of the limitations of I suppose you could say sort of structural or cultural forms of violence is that they are largely invisible, right? We're always trying to find new ways of being able to measure those as well. But we need to start from kind of sort of measuring that direct violence and then or that direct sort of, or that negative piece, and then complement to the extent feasible. We choose to take a sort of a different perspective than a lot of people do, and that is that we focus on peacefulness rather than conflict. We focus on the strengths rather than the gaps. Because we feel that that is a much more productive way of resolving the issues, because otherwise we tend to have this focus on counterterrorism. We tend to have this focus on peace negotiation. We have the tendency to try and solve the problem that we have most immediately in front of us. But that means that we are not sort of responding to the longer term needs. I feel like I haven't provided a good enough answer. Let me continue to think about it, if that's okay, Megan.
Thank you, Megan. We go to Avi, and then I will read just one question that Linda posted in the chat. So Avi, please.
Wonderful, thank you. I'm wondering, this is more, I guess, a personal question than a professional question, but how do you stay non-biased in your work when it is apparent what are best practices and not best practices? How do you keep the politics out of it to ensure that, you know, everything gets done in a neutral manner?
So, I mean, okay, sorry, it's just because I'm writing this, I'm writing this down. So I would say, you know, and I don't aim to be conflictive here, but I mean, a key philosophy for us is that it isn't necessarily apparent what are the best practices or not. One of the challenges that I feel that we've faced in many ways as a humanity is that we tend to think what we know is right and what isn't right, or what should be done and what should not be done. But oftentimes those assumptions that we have are not applicable in another culture or another context. I mean, if you take something as basic as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, for example, which we think that we can all agree to, well, the reality is that we can't agree to that. The reality is that there are a number of Muslim majority countries, especially conservative countries, that didn't sign up for the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and created another one that they then signed up to, because in certain cases, for example, in Sharia law, community takes priority over the individual, and that is something that is not represented in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And similarly, a lot of Asian countries didn't sign up to that declaration either, and modified it to create their own, because they also felt that it had sort of a Western bias. So what we try and do is really start always from the perspective of not knowing absolutely anything, only commenting based on the information that we can glean from our own research.
Thank you, Avi. And just to conclude this first section of Q&A, so there's a question from Linda in the chat that she asked, what happens after publishing or the data, the report? Any actions or recommendations?
So I mean, you mean when we launch it each year? So, you know, what we try and do is we try and do a variety of different launches, have a variety of different kind of sort of conversations. But a lot of this, you know, when, for example, we launched the Global Peace Index, once again, it provides a snapshot of peacefulness around the world. It's useful. It kind of sort of talks about trends. It gives us a certain amount of information, but essentially it all comes down to positive peace, right? And how we can, as a humanity, more effectively go about building positive peace. So, you know, for example, my mission, I sit very closely to the UN, is to be able to work with the UN and to be able to essentially convince departments to be able to use the positive peace metrics to be able to attract and influence what they then go about doing on their projects. This question does lead me very neatly into the next section, and I think I'll be able to answer your question more in detail.
Please, Michael.
All right, excellent. So there are some pretty cool things that happen when we start to look at positive peace and the way that all of this data interacts, and specifically how all of these pillars interact over time. One of the first things that we see is that with regards to the characteristics of positive peace as a thing, as a concept, it's very systemic in nature. What does that mean? It means that none of these pillars, all of these pillars are interrelated and interdependent. You can't have an impact on one single pillar without having an impact on the other pillars as well. And more importantly, we see that the countries that improve most sustainably in levels of positive peace do so by making small improvements to all pillars simultaneously. I equate this to kind of sort of trying to push a glass of water along a table without spilling it, and having to kind of sort of grasp the whole glass of water and just move it slowly as a whole, so as not to spill. In fact, you know, we see in some cases that when there is a significant investment in a pillar, it can have a negative effect in other areas. Now, we also see that it's slow moving. Positive peace isn't like a silver bullet. It's not a panacea. It takes time to build positive peace, as you can no doubt imagine. But the good news is that it's self-reinforcing. As countries have higher levels or develop higher levels of positive peace, it actually becomes easier and easier to develop more positive peace and become more peaceful over time. The fourth thing, and this goes back to, I believe, the previous question in some way, is that positive peace, and this is sort of the bit of the conceptual leap that we're taking, admittedly, but positive peace based on sort of its systemic characteristic is also contextual in nature. Now, what does that mean? It means that a well-functioning government in one particular context does not necessarily mean the same thing, right? For example, in the United States, you have people with fundamentally different beliefs about what a well-functioning government is. For one person, a well-functioning government is one that provides universal healthcare. For another one is one that's a very small government. So when there are distinct differences in perspectives, that is where the conflict generates. So you want to be able to make sure that you have a very good understanding of how each pillar is interpreted or can be redefined based on the context or the system that you are working in. Also, for example, well-functioning government in a tribe could mean a council of elders sitting around an acacia tree, but in a more formal setting, it could be sort of a mayor's office. But nonetheless, it speaks to a well-functioning government. The acceptance of the rights of others, for example, we touched on this very briefly before, can be seen as completely differently depending on the context that you are in as well. And then lastly, we find that positive peace is interlinked. Now, what does this mean? Well, basically, IEP, what we do is we study positive peace at the nation state level, right? But you can sort of take all of these different nation states and you compile them together in another system, in this case, the international community. You could then take the international community, all of the countries in their entirety, and combine those with the environment, and you would then have sort of a larger ecosystem, right? The biosphere that can also be looked at through the lens of positive peace and can be treated as a system. Now, similarly, you could also break down the nation into much smaller pieces as well, right? You can try and build positive peace in communities. You can try and build positive peace in organizations, or even have projects dedicated to building positive peace. Why? Because we see that small systems interact with a larger system. So if you build positive peace at a local level, it progressively builds positive peace at a national level. And the opposite is also true as well. So let me just take that down to sort of the nth degree to a very simple positive peace project, for example, right? Before we go back up to thinking about this at the national level. What does positive peace building look like at a local level? So this is just a random initiative that I came across in Kansas City here in the United States. It's been an initiative that's been underway in a neighborhood for quite some time with a high degree of success. Why? Well, because they very much took a systemic approach. With regards to a well-functioning government, they were able to establish a strong neighborhood council with members that had been born in the community and were very well respected. With regards to good relations with neighbors, they held very frequent community events, they had picnics, cleanups, they had all kinds of initiatives, and they had good interactions with the police. In fact, police liaisons actually participated in a lot of these events. These are in communities that had previously had very bad relationships with the police. They fomented a sound business environment, or they're still fomenting a sound business environment by creating spaces and opportunities for small entrepreneurs. They're contributing to a free flow of information within the community. So they have very frequent community meetings. They share a lot of information. They've got a highly informative website. They foment high levels of human capital, right? They concentrate on education, specifically trying to ensure that people don't drop out between primary and secondary education. They do things like demonstration gardens that not only help people sort of develop new trades and business opportunities, but also increase health within the community. With regards to equitable distribution of resources, in this case, they have a promoting equitable neighborhoods initiative. They have a neighborhood watch program to be able to strengthen the community's ability to fight crime. And they also have a very specific focus on developing racial equity as well. Now, importantly, they're not concentrating on one single one of these initiatives. They're kind of sort of taking a holistic approach, and they're thinking about this systemically, and they're trying to impact positively, but in a small way, all of these different pillars. Now, you can kind of sort of use the positive peace framework conceptually in any format. You can see this applied to a single neighborhood here, but you could apply it to a single project. You could apply it to your individual work. Another example here is one in Mexico. This is sort of a graph of various initiatives in the city of Culiacan, which is the home ground of El Chapo and the Sinaloa cartel. And the government there has adopted the positive peace framework to be able to kind of sort of look at all of the different initiatives that it has underway to make sure that as a government, it is trying to systemically build positive peace in every way. So, you know, in terms of kind of sort of what a quick takeaway could be, or how any one of us can essentially sort of use the pillars of positive peace, or can look at an issue or a theme or a system or a context through the lens of positive peace, you can do so by kind of sort of asking three essential questions, right? Number one, how are the pillars kind of sort of defined in the context of the system that I'm working in? Once again, if I'm in a community in Costa Rica, the interpretation or the needs of a well-functioning government are completely different. For example, let me just give you a quick example. The other day, we were working with an association that supports sex workers in Medellin in Colombia, right? The needs of sex workers in Colombia in terms of what they see as a well-functioning government are completely different as to what I would see in my particular context as a well-functioning government, right? In my particular context, a well-functioning government is a government that ensures that my recycling is collected on time. In the context of sex workers in Medellin, it's making sure that when they call the police come. So having a very good understanding of these pillars and their characteristics in the context that you're in is key. Number two, what are the things that are already strong? What pillars are already strong? That helps you identify areas in which you can potentially contribute. And then the third one is, well, how can I ensure, let's say I want to contribute to high levels of human capital in a particular society through a particular program for a particular organization, how can I ensure that my contribution is systemic in nature as well? And you can reuse that, the framework of positive peace, the lens of positive peace, to look at your own initiatives, to make sure that you are also being systemic in your approach. Let me end with one final example. Also in Medellin in Colombia, there was a German organization that decided to open up that was working in one of the prisons there where a lot of the gang members work, and they decided to start an initiative in which they opened up a wing of the prison that had lower levels of security, that gave inmates access to a library and better food, providing they agreed to stop trading drugs and to give over their weapons. Now, initially, this was very successful, but ultimately it had to close. Why? Because the guards refused to participate in any activities related to that wing of the prison. Why? Because the guards were very badly paid, and the only way that they could keep working in the prison was if they received a commission from the drug transactions within the commission as well. Now, you know, this is a clear case of an organization doing some very well-intentioned work, but one that really doesn't consider the systemic impact that it may be having. So with that, I'll leave it there. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Michael. The floor is open.
Yes, can I?
Yes, Sibyl, please.
just about your last example, I think it's a very interesting example. But then from your concept, how would you then address this? So because it's a systemic problem, right? That the prison wards are not getting enough pay. And if you want still to do something for in the prison as well, but you know the system is not favoring, how do you look based on your experience? What would be some steps and concrete ideas how to deal with this?
Mm-hmm. Well, you know, IEP in some ways is kind of sort of in a very luxurious position, right? In which we as a research institution make general recommendations or sort of present these frameworks, but the hard work is up to the actual implementers. The first thing I would say is having a very good understanding of the context is key. The second is taking into account all of the stakeholders that may be involved. So for example, this organization was very focused on the prisoners as being the stakeholders, but wasn't in the full realization that the actual stakeholders involved here were actually a lot broader. So being as inclusive as you can when you have these conversations and when learning about the context, I think is a very important step. And then simply just kind of sort of modifying your specific activities based on what the potential outcomes would be. And, you know, more importantly, if you have a very good idea on how people interpret these 8 pillars of positive peace, or how the different stakeholders interpret these pillars of positive peace, it makes it more likely that you're going to be able to generate solutions that are positive for everybody. As to specific recommendations for this, I really couldn't say because I don't have a good enough understanding of that particular system.
Thank you, Sibyl. Megan, do you want to ask a question or no?
I don't have any questions to ask about this. I'm still processing, but I'm hoping I can ask my question about the previous one that just came to me. So it's specifically about Denmark. So I know Denmark scores very high on the Positive Peace Index. It's considered a very peaceful country. But I'm wondering, I know that their approach to migration is not in accordance with international human rights standards. So recently they passed a law where they are, I believe, returning asylum seekers, or they're not allowing them to stay within the country. So I'm wondering, as the world becomes more complex, especially related to issues of migration, I wonder what your perspective is on how that's going to play out. Do you have any guesses on what that's going to look like in the future?
Yeah, thank you, Megan. And that's a really complex question in many ways. I mean, the first thing that I'd kind of sort of like to refer back to is that in terms of, say, talking about the characteristics of peaceful nations, bear in mind that once again, we're not approaching this from sort of a moral or an ethical perspective about what should or should not be done. We are purely identifying the correlations between these sort of direct measures of violence that we see. And a variety of different sort of socioeconomic indicators, as many as we can possibly find, that actually sort of have this lead correlation. Now, things with regards to hostility for foreigners, that is a specific indicator. Now, I don't know exactly where, for example, Denmark tracks on that particular indicator. So it may be doing poorly, it may have deteriorated, I'm not sure. And also kind of sort of things with relations to good relations with neighbors as well. I'm not exactly sure where it stands. I do know that it has high levels of positive peace. I couldn't exactly tell you if it's been deteriorating or increasing, unfortunately, but I know that it does. I know that it does well. So it does have a lot of good things going for it. In terms of sort of predicting what will happen, especially as we continue to see these increasing levels of migration. You know, we produce the ecological threat register, and between population growth, increasing food insecurity, and water stress, we're going to see significant migration over the next 30 years. And a lot of that migration, although a lot of migration sort of happens and remains close or even within the country, a significant portion of that is going to move sort of north in some ways. So we do expect that to create conflict in the same way that the Syria and the Afghan refugee crisis had in Europe more broadly from 2014 to 2016. That's ongoing in many ways. But yeah, I do think, you know, more philosophically or conceptually, there is a challenge. And You know, whenever there is a society and whenever there are changes within a society, when there's an increasing amount of diversity within a society, in many ways, what you're just seeing is you're just seeing different perspectives on life. And in the same way that it becomes more difficult, you know, a growing city becomes more difficult to manage because you have more people, you have more different perspectives, you have more nationalities. I think that is largely true for wider things as well.
Thank you, Megan. We have 3 more people to ask questions. So I think that we can have these 3 questions because we have only 5 minutes to close this webinar. So first, Dani, after Christoph and Emmy, please.
Just very quickly and in general, what is next for you and for the indexing of the world? I know you did the Global Peace Index, and then now you're doing positive peace in the case of Mexico, and organized crime you mentioned, stuff like that. So I'm very interested in how important is it to you to maintain the Global Peace Index as it is, to be able to trace long term, but also what are you looking at next? What are some new areas of interest that you want to go into?
Thank you, Dani. So our mission is to make the peace, the planet more. Sorry, is to make life more peaceful and prosperous for the majority of the people on the planet. Now, we're not an implementation organization, we're a research organization, so we're going to continue to do that. We always want to sort of improve the research that we do. We're going to be concentrating a lot more on the systems dynamics related to peace and peace building. We think that's important. We're doing a lot of study on tipping points, you know, specific points that you can get to in terms of social development or in terms of any one of the positive peace indicators where you see a significant improvement or deterioration in levels of peacefulness, so that we can more aptly target ways of building positive peace, and also to kind of increase the predictive ability of our research over time. Because if we can put those tools at the disposal of not only people like the UN, but also of national and local governments as well, we can more effectively build positive peace over time. Thanks for the question.
Thank you, Dani. Christoph?
Yeah, I have kind of additional question to my first one. So seeing one of the pillars saying good relations with neighbors. So how do you see the kind of renewed power policy of Russia concerning its neighboring European states, like Ukraine and partly Belarus? Did they have also a significant effort, not only in the classification of the 2 countries, but also on Russia?
So the short answer, Christoph, is I think yes. I have to apologize because I'm not completely up to date with a lot of the research regarding Russia. So time and time again, I'm going to other countries to kind of sort of draw a parallelism here. I apologize, but the short answer is yes. I definitely think that has an impact, both in terms of its negative peace score on the Global Peace Index and its positive peace score. Just because it's recent, let me give, for example, the example of Palestine and Israel. Now, you know, you may have, or anybody may have, very distinct opinions as to who is the victim and who is the victimizer in that particular context. An IEP makes no judgment about that, and that is not reflected in the index either. What we do say, however, is that when there is not good relations with neighbors, then it results in conflict, right? Which is something that we are seeing right here. So you know, and the reason I say that is because in some occasions people have said, well, how can we be expected to have a good relations with our neighbors when this country does this to us? You know, we're not saying that you should sort of lay down that there should be any particular process here. What we are just doing is we're identifying when it is most likely that there will then be conflict over time.
Thank you, Christoph. Emmy?
How do you cover the invisible problems such as suicide? Because Japan is quite high in this index, but suicide rate is quite high. So is that covered by World Happiness Index? Or?
Yes. So I don't know the exact details in the case of suicide. I believe that it is a proxy related to the number of deaths committed by the number of suicides by firearm. So on occasions in which there is, for example, data points that we simply can't collect because they're not reported or they're not reported in the same way across countries, we come up or we analyze the closest proxy that we can or the most reliable proxy, and then we base it on that.
Thank you, Michael. We have just 1 minute to conclude this webinar. I am really grateful for your presence and also for everyone that joined this webinar and with interesting questions. And I think that we have more provocative, in a sense that we have more to think and more to do, and also more to research and also to contribute to the research on peace. Thank you very much. And there is just one.
If it's all right with you, I just wanted to mention very briefly, Mauricio, for those of
Yes,
you who would be interested in learning more about positive peace, not only do we have the Positive Peace Index and the Global Peace Index on our website, but there's also a Positive Peace Academy online. It's a free online course. It takes about a couple of hours. It includes all of our research around positive peace, and we invite you to join it. And also, please feel free to contact me with additional questions on my email or to follow us on the channels.